One morning, Dr. Watson woke up covered in blood. Not a few drops, not a small stain. His hands, his clothes, even his bedsheets were soaked in it. But there was one terrifying problem. The blood wasn't his. And Watson had absolutely no memory of what happened the night before. Before we uncover this mystery, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching this story from today? Which country? Which city? Now let me take you back to London. November 3rd, 1894. Chapter 1. The Stain Upon Waking. A lamplighter made his rounds along Baker Street that evening, his long pole tapping each gas mantle into reluctant life. And I watched him from behind the glass as one watches a priest performing a familiar sacrament, methodical, unhurried, touching flame to darkness with the quiet certainty of a man who believes his small office holds back something larger than night. He did not look up toward our window. He never did. And yet, I found a peculiar comfort in his passing, as though his ritual assured me that the world beyond our rooms still moved according to its ancient, dependable machinery. Behind me, the sitting room of 221B had arranged itself into that particular configuration of warmth and stillness that I have never quite been able to reproduce in any other dwelling. The fire had surrendered its ambition hours ago, and now merely breathed among its embers, casting a copper light that softened the chaos of Holmes's belongings into something almost beautiful. Papers mounted upon every surface. The Persian slipper stuffed with tobacco rested upon the mantelpiece, beside a row of commonplace books, whose spines had long since abandoned legibility. The air carried that singular fragrance unique to our quarters, a marriage of pipe smoke, chemical reagent, and old leather that I have come to associate so thoroughly with home that I suspect I shall smell it on my deathbed and mistake it for paradise. Holmes himself sat at the chemical table near the window, bent over a shallow dish of some pale solution, his aquiline profile illuminated by the steady flame of a spirit lamp. He had not spoken in over 2 hours. This was not unusual. His silences were as varied and distinct as other men's conversations, some restless, some dangerous, and some, like this one, possessing a quality of deep, almost meditative absorption that rendered him as still and remote as a figure in stained glass. I had long since learned to read these silences the way a sailor reads weather, and tonight's carried no threat of storm. I returned to my chair and to the volume of Montaigne that lay open upon my knee, though the philosopher's gentle skepticism could not quite hold me. My thoughts drifted instead toward the nature of calm itself, how it never announces its own departure, how one never thinks to treasure an ordinary evening until it has become the last ordinary evening, the final unmarked hour before the ledger of one's life acquires a new and terrible entry. But I did not know that yet. On the 3rd of November, in the year 1894, I knew only lamplight, silence, and the steady breathing of the fire, and I mistook these things for safety. A draught of restless sleep. I retired shortly before 11, leaving Holmes still hunched over his chemical table with the focused intensity of a man conducting a private conversation with the universe. He offered no word of good night, nor did I expect one. Our domesticity had long since shed the need for such formalities, and I climbed the 17 stairs to my bedroom with the comfortable weariness of a man whose only remaining obligation was to surrender himself to sleep. But sleep, that evening, would not be surrendered to so easily. I lay beneath the heavy counterpane and listened to the house settle around me. The soft complaint of old timber, the distant murmur of a hansom passing through the street below, the occasional clink of glass from the sitting room where Holmes continued his nocturnal devotions. These were the sounds that ordinarily ushered me into dreamless rest, as reliable as any lullaby. Yet tonight they seemed to arrive from a great distance, as though Baker Street itself were slowly retreating from me, pulling away like a ship from its mooring, while I remained fixed upon some darker shore. When sleep finally came, it brought no mercy with it. I was back in Afghanistan. Not the Afghanistan of maps and military dispatches, but the Afghanistan that lives beneath the ribs of every man who served there. A landscape composed not of geography, but of sensation. The dry, mineral taste of dust against cracked lips, The weight of a bone saw in hands that trembled not from fear, but from the simple, relentless arithmetic of too many wounded and too few hours. I stood in the surgical tent at my wand, and the canvas walls breathed in and out like the lungs of some dying creature, and the light was the color of old brass, and everywhere there was blood. I woke once, briefly, at what must have been 1:30. My heart was laboring, and the sheets were damp with perspiration. Something felt wrong. Not dramatically, not as a clear alarm, but as a subtle wrongness, the kind one feels when a familiar painting has been shifted 1/2 inch upon its nail. I listened. The house was silent. Even Holmes, it seemed, had finally retired. I told myself it was nothing more than the old wounds remembering themselves, as they sometimes did when the weather turned, or the mind grew careless in its watch. I closed my eyes and allowed the darkness to reclaim me. It was the last conscious choice I would make that night. The waking horror. The first thing I became aware of was the smell. Thick, ferrous, unmistakable to any man who has practiced medicine or served upon a battlefield. It was the smell of blood, and it was everywhere. I opened my eyes to the grey half-light that precedes a London dawn, that uncertain hour when the world exists in a state of provisional reality, as though it has not yet decided whether to fully commit to another day. My bedroom was cold. The fire had died entirely, and the air that touched my face carried the damp chill of a room whose door has stood open through the night. I raised my hands. They were red. Not the faint rust of a minor cut, not the pale stain of a nosebleed carelessly wiped, but red with the deep arterial conviction of serious bleeding. The blood had dried in the creases of my palms, had darkened beneath my fingernails, had soaked into the cuffs of my nightshirt with the thoroughness of a dye. I stared at my hands as one stares at a letter written in one's own script that contains words one does not remember composing. I sat upright. The counterpane was streaked with long, terrible smears where I had evidently turned in my sleep. My nightshirt clung to my chest, stiff in places where the blood had dried to a brittle crust. I touched my torso, my arms, my face, searching with a surgeon's practiced fingers for the wound that must surely explain this horror. There was none. The blood was not my own. A sound escaped me then. Not a cry, not quite a word, but some involuntary utterance that belonged to the animal vocabulary of pure fear. I threw aside the ruined bedclothes and stood, swaying slightly as the room tilted and then righted itself. My boots stood beside the door, and even from across the room, I could see they were caked with mud, a dark, heavy clay that did not belong to Baker Street, nor to any pavement I could recall walking upon. The bedroom door was ajar. I had closed it firmly upon retiring. I remembered the particular click of the latch, remembered testing it once, as was my habit. Someone had opened that door in the night. Someone had gone through it. I looked down again at my hands, at the blood that had dried into a map of accusation across every line and crease, and felt the foundations of my understanding of myself shift beneath me, like ground above a fault. Whatever had happened in the hours I could not remember, my body had been its instrument, and the evidence was written upon me in the oldest language the world has ever known. Holmes observes before he speaks. His eyes found me immediately, not my face, but my hands, my nightshirt, the muddy tracks I left upon the stairs behind me. I watched those eyes perform their terrible, precise inventory, moving from one detail to the next with the systematic attention of a man cataloguing specimens. The blood's color, its distribution, the pattern of its drying, the mud on my bare ankles, the state of my cuffs. All of this he consumed in perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds I felt myself transformed from a friend into evidence. He said nothing. The silence between us was of a variety I had never before experienced in all our years of companionship. Not the comfortable silence of shared evening, nor the taut silence that preceded a revelation, but a silence that carried within it the dreadful weight of assessment. Holmes was not merely observing, he was deciding something. "Holmes," I said, and my voice emerged as something cracked and unfamiliar. "Holmes, I cannot account for this." His eyes found me immediately. Not my face, but my hands, my nightshirt, the muddy tracks I left upon the stairs behind me. I watched those eyes perform their terrible, precise inventory, moving from one detail to the next with the systematic attention of a man cataloguing specimens. The blood's color, its distribution, the pattern of its drying, the mud on my bare ankles, the state of my cuffs. All of this he consumed in perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds I felt myself transformed from a friend into evidence. He said nothing. The silence between us was of a variety I had never before experienced in all our years of companionship. Not the comfortable silence of shared evening, nor the taut silence that preceded a revelation, but a silence that carried within it the dreadful weight of assessment. Holmes was not merely observing, he was deciding something. "Holmes," I said, and my voice emerged as something cracked and unfamiliar. He raised one hand, a small, precise gesture that simultaneously acknowledged my distress and requested my patience. Then he crossed the room to where I stood and, without a word, took my right hand in both of his. He turned it over, examined the palm, pressed his thumb gently against the dried blood along the heel of my hand, and raised my fingers toward the lamp to study the substance beneath my nails. His touch was clinical but not cold. It was the touch of a man who understood that the body before him belonged to someone he valued, even as he interrogated it for secrets. "The blood is approximately 5 hours old," he said quietly. "Arterial in origin, judging by its color prior to oxidation. The quantity suggests a significant wound, not necessarily fatal but serious. It is not yours." "I know it is not mine." "No," he said, and something moved behind his eyes, something I could not read. "No, I did not suppose it was." He released my hand but did not step away. His gaze moved to my boots by the bedroom door above, though of course he had already examined them. He had examined everything. He had, I now understood, been examining things since long before I woke. The question that cannot be asked. The question formed itself in my throat with the weight and shape of something physical. A stone, a bullet, a fragment of bone. I had carried questions before, in the surgical tent and upon the battlefield, questions whose answers arrived wearing the face of death. But none had ever turned inward with such devastating precision. "Holmes," I said, "have I done something terrible?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the deal table where his chemical apparatus still sat from the previous evening and cleared a small space with deliberate, unhurried hands. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, because obedience to Holmes in moments of crisis had become as natural to me as breathing. He lit the spirit lamp, then produced a clean glass slide, and with a penknife scraped a small quantity of dried blood from beneath my thumbnail. He held the slide to the flame, observing its behavior with an expression of absolute neutrality. "Your fingernails," he said, "show no evidence of defensive tearing. Your knuckles are unmarked. There is no bruising upon your hands consistent with the delivery of a blow." He set down the slide and examined my right cuff, pulling it taut between his fingers. "The blood distribution on your sleeves suggests you are kneeling over the source, not standing, not struggling. The pattern is consistent with proximity to a wound, not the infliction of one." I heard his words, and I understood their clinical meaning, and yet they brought me no comfort. For the absence of evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence, and both Holmes and I knew this. He then knelt. Sherlock Holmes knelt before me, and examined my bootlaces with a magnifying lens. The laces had been retied, but poorly, with a knot that was not my own. Someone had removed my boots and replaced them. Holmes noted this without comment, but I saw the slight narrowing of his eyes that, in the grammar of his expressions, constituted a full paragraph of concern. "We must retrace your movements," he said at last, rising. "From the evidence of the mud, a particular alluvial clay found primarily along the Limehouse reach, you traveled some considerable distance in the night. Your boots were removed and replaced by someone other than yourself. You were in close, sustained contact with a bleeding individual." He paused and looked at me directly, not at my hands, not at the blood, but at my face, at my eyes, as one man looks at another when the truth must be spoken plainly. You did not do this of your own volition, Watson. Of that I am already certain. But someone used you last night. Your skills, your hands, your knowledge. And we must discover who and why before the morning is much older." He turned toward the bedroom stairs. "Dress quickly. Bring your service revolver. And Watson." He hesitated, and in that hesitation I glimpsed something I had witnessed perhaps 3 times in all the years of our association. It was not fear. It was the careful, controlled suppression of fury. "Do not wash your hands. Not yet. The blood is evidence, and we shall need every syllable it can speak." I rose and climbed the stairs on legs that felt borrowed from another man, carrying with me the terrible, unspeakable weight of a question that Holmes had not quite answered, and that I was not yet brave enough to ask again. Chapter 2. The Hours Unaccounted. We descended into Baker Street at an hour when London belongs not to its citizens, but to its ghosts. The gas lamps still burned along the pavement, though their light had taken on the sickly, exhausted quality of flames that have labored through the night and know themselves to be approaching obsolescence. Dawn was a suggestion rather than a fact, a faint graying along the eastern rooftops that promised nothing and revealed less. The fog had thinned since the previous evening, but had not departed, lingering in the doorways and alley mouths like a reluctant congregation after a funeral. Holmes moved ahead of me with that particular stride I knew so well. Long, purposeful, his chin slightly elevated, as though he were reading the air itself. He had dressed with unusual speed, foregoing his customary precision in favor of urgency, and his grey travelling cloak billowed slightly as he walked. I followed in his wake, my hands thrust into my coat pockets where I would not have to see them. The service revolver, a cold and reassuring weight against my hip. He stopped at the foot of our front steps and crouched, his magnifying lens already in hand. The pavement bore a confusion of marks, the ordinary traffic of a London street, but Holmes's eye moved through this chaos the way a scholar's eye moves through a palimpsest, dismissing the recent and the irrelevant until he found the layer he sought. "Here," he murmured, tracing a line with his finger. "Your stride, Watson. I know it as well as I know my own. But observe, the spacing is irregular, shorter on the left, longer on the right, with a slight drag at the toe. This is not the gait of a man walking with purpose. This is the gait of a man walking under the influence of something that has loosened his connection to his own limbs." He rose and followed the trail southward along Baker Street, pausing at intervals to consult the pavement with his lens. I watched him read my own footsteps, the unconscious autobiography my body had written upon the London streets while my mind slept, and felt the peculiar violation of having one's most private hours narrated by the stones beneath one's feet. At the corner of Marylebone Road, Holmes stopped again. A second set of prints converged with mine, smaller, lighter, deliberately placed. Someone had walked beside me. Someone had guided me through the sleeping city with the careful attentiveness of a shepherd leading an animal that does not know it is being led. "There were 2 of you," Holmes said, straightening. His voice was quiet, but carried the particular tautness I associated with the early movements of a hunt. "And the second knew precisely where you were going." The testimony of the night cabman. We found him at the stand near the Great Central Hotel, a thick-set man with a red face and the cautious, appraising eyes of one who has spent his professional life making rapid judgments about the character and sobriety of strangers. His horse, a patient bay mare with a blanket thrown across her back against the chill, stood with the philosophical resignation of an animal long accustomed to irregular hours. Holmes approached with that particular manner he adopted when interviewing members of the working trades, respectful but direct, stripped of condescension, carrying the unspoken assurance that he understood their world well enough to waste none of their time. "You were working last night," Holmes said. It was not a question. The cabman regarded him with the careful neutrality of a man deciding whether cooperation would prove profitable or troublesome. "I was. Between the hours of 1 and 3, you collected a fare near this location. A gentleman, tall, moustached, wearing a dark overcoat, unsteady on his feet. He was not alone." Something shifted in the cabman's expression. Recognition, followed swiftly by the particular wariness of a man who suspects he has been involved in something irregular. He glanced at me, and I saw his eyes widen slightly as he matched my face to his memory. "That's the one," he said, nodding toward me. "Thought he was drunk, I did, leaning heavy on the other fellow's arm, eyes half closed, mumbling something I couldn't make out." The other gentleman, thin, very polite, very calm. He gave the address and helped your friend here into the cab, paid double fare in advance. "The address," Holmes said. "Harker Lane, Limehouse, down by the old chandler's warehouses. Not the sort of place you take a gentleman, and I said as much. But the thin one, he just smiled and said his friend was a doctor and was needed urgently." Holmes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Describe the thin man." "Medium height, pale, clean-shaven, dressed well but not showy. Military bearing, I'd say. Straight-backed, precise in his movements. Spoke like an educated man, and his hands—" The cabman paused, frowning at the memory. "His hands were very clean. I noticed because he wore no gloves despite the cold, and his hands were the cleanest I've ever seen on a man at that hour. Scrubbed, like." "A surgeon's hands," Holmes murmured, and though his tone did not change, I felt the word strike me like a physical blow. A surgeon. A man who knew what my hands could do, and had come to Baker Street in the dead of night to make them do it. Holmes thanked the cabman, pressed a sovereign into his palm, and turned eastward toward Limehouse without another word. I followed, carrying with me the cabman's testimony like a weight sewn into the lining of my coat. The knowledge that I had been led through the streets of London like a sleepwalker, my skills requisitioned by a stranger who understood precisely what I was and precisely what I was worth. The surgical room at Harker Lane. Limehouse received us with the grey indifference of a district accustomed to irregular arrivals. The streets narrowed as we moved eastward, shedding the broad respectability of the West End for the compressed, shadowed architecture of the Docklands, where buildings leaned toward one another across cramped lanes like conspirators exchanging secrets. The smell of the river thickened, brine and mud, and the faint, sweet decay of tidal rack. And beneath it, as we turned into Harker Lane, something sharper. Carbolic acid, chloroform. The antiseptic vocabulary of a medical space, carried on the cold air like a whisper from an open wound. The building was a former chandler's warehouse, its ground floor windows boarded, its brickwork stained with the accumulated soot of decades. Holmes found the entrance, a side door, unlocked, its hinges recently oiled, and we passed through into a corridor that smelled of damp plaster and paraffin. At its end, a second door stood slightly ajar, and beyond it lay the room that would confirm everything Holmes had suspected and everything I had feared. It was a surgical theatre. Not the grand amphitheatre of a teaching hospital, but a functional, improvised operating space, assembled with the efficiency of a military field station. A wooden table stood at its center, its surface scarred and stained, covered with a sheet that bore the unmistakable geography of recent bleeding, a dark, spreading continent surrounded by the smaller archipelagos of splatter and transfer. Beside the table, arranged upon a cloth with regimental precision, lay a set of surgical instruments, scalpels, retractors, clamps, suturing needles, a probe. They had been wiped but not sterilized, and in the grey light that filtered through a single high window, I could see the faint pink residue that no hasty cleaning can entirely remove. Holmes moved through the space with the silent, systematic attention of a man reading a room the way others read a book, left to right, surface to depth, text to subtext. He examined the instruments without touching them, studied the stains upon the table, crouched to inspect a series of drops upon the floor that traced a path from the table to a basin in the corner. The basin held water, now cold and dark with diluted blood, and on the table beside the instruments, a brown glass bottle with a ground stopper. Holmes lifted it, uncorked it, and held it beneath his nose for the briefest instant before replacing it with a controlled, deliberate motion. "Chloroform," he said, "and something else, a compound I do not immediately recognize, though I have my suspicions." He turned to me, and his expression held something I had rarely seen directed at myself. A careful, calibrated pity that he was attempting to disguise as professional interest. "Someone performed surgery in this room last night, Watson. performed it with considerable skill. The suturing pattern visible on this cloth suggests a trained hand, steady, economical, practiced. He paused. Your hand. I looked at the table, at the instruments, at the basin of bloodied water, and felt the room contract around me until it was no larger than a coffin. My hands, my surgeon's hands, had worked in this room while my mind wandered through Afghan dreams. The instruments of healing, laid out with such careful precision, had been wielded by my body in service of a purpose I could not recall and had never consented to. The violation was not of the flesh. It was of something far more intimate. It was the theft of vocation itself. A name written in Watson's hand. Holmes spent a further 20 minutes examining the room with a thoroughness that bordered upon the devotional, cataloguing every stain, every fibre, every faint impression left upon the dusty surfaces by hands and instruments and the passage of bodies in the night. I stood near the door and watched, unable to bring myself to touch anything in that space, as though contact might complete some terrible circuit between the man I was and the man I had been made to become during the lost hours. It was among a sheaf of papers scattered beneath a wooden stool, receipts mostly, for medical supplies purchased under a false name, that Holmes found it. He drew the single sheet from the pile with the care of a man extracting a thorn, held it to the light from the high window, and went very still. "Watson," he said, "come here." I crossed the room on unwilling feet. He held the paper toward me, and I saw what had arrested him. It was a sheet of plain notepaper, unheaded, and upon it, in handwriting I recognized with the immediate, visceral certainty of a man recognizing his own face in a mirror, were written 7 words. Eleanor Caston, 14 Threadwell Court, Whitechapel. My handwriting. My particular formation of the capital E with its elongated crossbar. My characteristic slant. My ink. I could see, even in that poor light, the distinctive blue-black of the Stevens ink I kept in my writing desk at Baker Street. "I have never heard this name," I said, and my voice sounded distant and strange, as though it too had been borrowed and imperfectly returned. "I do not know this woman. I have never been to Threadwell Court." "And yet your hand wrote this address," Holmes replied, with the fluency and certainty of a man recording something familiar rather than something dictated. He studied the paper a moment longer, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. His expression had shifted. The clinical detachment that had governed his features since our departure from Baker Street had given way to something else, a quality of intense, focused interest that I recognized from the opening movements of those cases that would later come to consume him entirely. But there was something more. Beneath the intellectual engagement, beneath the hunter's quickening instinct, I detected a note I could not immediately identify. It was not until we had left that terrible room and stood once more in the cold, river-scented air of Harker Lane that I understood what I had seen in my friend's expression. It was recognition. Not of the name, not of the address, but of the method. Something in the careful orchestration of this night's events had touched a memory in Holmes's vast mental catalogue, and whatever that memory contained had turned his interest from professional curiosity into something considerably more personal. He said nothing of it. He merely adjusted his collar against the cold and said, with a quietness that belied the intensity I had observed, "We must find Eleanor Caston before the morning is out. And Watson, when we find her, I suspect we shall also find the beginning of an answer to a question I have been carrying for rather longer than this single night." Holmes's uncharacteristic gentleness. We walked westward along the river, and the Thames moved beside us like a slow grey witness, carrying its ancient cargo of secrets and silt toward the sea with the patient indifference of something that has seen too much to be surprised by anything the city deposits upon its banks. The dawn had finally committed itself, spreading a thin, cold light across the water that illuminated without warming, and the early traffic of the docklands had begun. Carts and barrows and the hunched figures of labourers moving toward the wharves with the mechanical resignation of men whose days begin before their spirits are ready. Holmes walked beside me in silence for some minutes, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his traveling cloak, his gaze fixed upon some interior horizon that I could not see. I had grown accustomed over the years to these periods of internal withdrawal, the great machine of his intellect engaging its gears and beginning to turn, and I knew better than to interrupt. But there was something different in his bearing this morning, a tension in his shoulders, a deliberateness in his stride that suggested not merely thought, but the active suppression of feeling. We had reached the commercial road when he stopped, not to examine a clue or to hail a cab, but simply to stop, to stand still upon the pavement while London moved around us like a river parting around a stone. He turned to me, and what I saw in his face was something I had encountered so rarely in our long association that each instance remained preserved in my memory like a specimen in amber. It was tenderness, unadorned, undefended, and utterly deliberate. He placed his hand upon my shoulder, not briefly, not as a passing gesture of camaraderie, but with the firm, sustained pressure of a man who means to anchor another man to the earth. "We shall find the truth of this, Watson," he said, "and you shall bear it, whatever it proves to be, and I have my suspicions, which I shall share when they have ripened from conjecture to conviction. You shall bear it, because you are the strongest man I know, not the cleverest, God knows, the faintest ghost of a smile, but the strongest, and I have never said that to another living soul." He released my shoulder and resumed walking, and I followed, carrying his words like a lamp held against the vast darkness of everything I did not yet understand. The river moved beside us, grey and indifferent, washing its endless freight of evidence toward the sea. And somewhere ahead of us, in a cramped court in Whitechapel, behind a door I had never knowingly approached, a woman named Eleanor Carston was waiting, alive or dead, with the answer written upon her body in the same blood that stained my hands. Chapter 3. The Woman, the Wound, and the War Within. Threadwell Court announced itself, not through any sign or marker, but through the particular quality of its silence. The dense, watchful quiet of a place whose inhabitants have learned that attention from the outside world rarely arrives bearing gifts. The court was a narrow passage off Whitechapel Road, flanked by tenement buildings, whose brickwork bore the accumulated grief of half a century's neglect, and the air within it carried the composite fragrance of poverty, boiled cabbage, coal dust, the sour sweetness of drains overwhelmed by the demands placed upon them. Number 14 stood at the far end, distinguishable from its neighbors only by a window box containing the desiccated remains of geraniums that had not survived the autumn. Holmes knocked twice, firmly, but without the peremptory force that might have frightened the occupant, and we waited. The door was opened by a woman of perhaps 35, slight of frame, with dark hair pulled back from a face that was striking in its pallor and composure. She wore a plain grey dress and stood with the careful, measured posture of a person managing considerable pain. Her left hand rested against the doorframe. Her right was pressed, almost unconsciously, against her lower abdomen. Her eyes moved from Holmes to me, and something happened to her expression that I shall carry to my grave. It was recognition, immediate, absolute, and suffused with a gratitude so profound that it bordered upon anguish. "Dr. Watson," she said, "you came back." The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond, but found myself unable to speak, because this woman, this stranger, was looking at me with the eyes of someone whose life I had apparently saved, and I could not remember a single moment of the act. Holmes stepped forward with quiet authority. "Miss Carston, my name is Sherlock Holmes. I believe you have already met my colleague, though the circumstances of that meeting require some clarification. May we come in?" She admitted us to a small parlor, modestly furnished but scrupulously clean, where a coal fire burned with the careful economy of someone who counts each lump. She moved slowly, and when she lowered herself into a chair, I saw her wince, the controlled, practiced wince of a patient accustomed to pain, but determined not to surrender to it. I studied her with a physician's eye, and what I observed confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The careful posture, the hand pressed to the abdomen, the pallor, the slight sheen of perspiration at her temples despite the room's modest warmth, This woman had recently undergone abdominal surgery, and the hands that had performed it, I now understood with a certainty that sat like ice in my chest, had been my own. The story she will not finish. Eleanor Carston told her story the way a woman walks across a frozen river, testing each step, listening for the crack that signals the point beyond which further progress becomes impossible. Holmes sat opposite her in a straight-backed chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his attention so complete that it seemed to draw the very words from her mouth by gravitational force. I remained standing near the window, unable to sit, unable to do anything but listen as a stranger narrated an event that should have been my own memory. "I was attacked 4 nights ago," she began, her voice steady but thin, like a wire drawn too taut. "In the alley behind the 10 Bells public house. I had been working late. I take in mending for the households on Commercial Street, and I was walking home. He came from behind. I did not see his face clearly. He wore a dark coat and a low hat, and he said nothing. Nothing at all. He simply—" She paused. Her hand moved to her abdomen again, pressing against the wound beneath her dress, as though to reassure herself that it had been closed, that the damage had been contained. "He stabbed me. Once. Very deliberately. And then he left me there." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his right thumb press against his left with the particular force that indicated intense internal activity. "You did not go to a hospital?" "I could not." Her eyes dropped to her lap. "There are reasons, circumstances, that make it impossible for me to present myself to the authorities or to any institution that might involve them. I was told there was a doctor who could help, a man who helps those who cannot seek help through ordinary channels." "Told by whom?" Holmes asked. And here Eleanor Carston's narrative struck the ice it had been testing for. Her composure, maintained with such careful discipline, fractured along a single line of absolute terror. "I cannot say his name," she whispered. "He will know. He has ways of knowing. He told me that if I spoke of him to anyone at all, he would ensure that the next wound would not be one any doctor could repair." She looked at me then, and her eyes held the desperate, contradictory plea of a woman who wants to be saved, but fears that the act of salvation will itself prove fatal. "The doctor, you, Dr. Watson, you were kind. Even though you seemed confused, seemed not entirely present, your hands were so gentle. You spoke to me as you worked, though your words made little sense. You called me by another name. You called me Mary." The room contracted. The fire dimmed. The air left my lungs as though drawn out by a syringe. Mary. My late wife's name, spoken by my own lips in a surgical theatre I could not remember entering, while my hands performed the work they had been trained to do upon a woman whose name I had never known. Holmes did not look at me. He did not need to. He knew precisely what that name had cost me. The Spectre of Dr. Mortimer Gale. We left Eleanor Carston with assurances of protection that Holmes delivered with such quiet, absolute authority that even I, who knew how slender our resources truly were, found myself believing them. He arranged for one of his trusted irregulars, a sharp-eyed boy named Denton, to watch the entrance to Threadwell Court, and he instructed Miss Carston to admit no one until she heard from us again. In the cab travelling westward, Holmes sat in silence for several minutes, his gaze fixed upon the passing streets, but focused, I knew, upon something far more distant. When he spoke, it was with the measured deliberation of a man who has been assembling a structure in his mind and is now prepared to reveal its architecture. "The compound on your handkerchief, the one mixed with the chloroform, is not a common preparation. It is, in fact, exceedingly rare, and I have encountered it only once before in my professional experience. It was developed during the Afghan campaign by a military surgeon who believed that the combination of chloroform and certain alkaloid derivatives could produce a state of what he termed directed somnambulism, a condition in which the subject, while unconscious of his actions, could nonetheless perform complex physical tasks, if guided by verbal instruction. He turned to me, and his expression held something I recognized but could not immediately place. It was the look he wore when a case ceased to be merely interesting and became, by some private calculus I was never fully able to penetrate, important. The surgeon's name, Holmes said, was Dr. Mortimer Gale. The name arrived in my consciousness, like a shell striking a position long thought secure. Mortimer Gale. I had not heard it in over a decade, had deliberately buried it beneath the other, more bearable memories of my military service. And yet it rose now with terrible immediacy. The thin face, the pale eyes, the hands that were always immaculate, the voice that carried the particular music of absolute, unshakable self-regard. "He was court-martialed," I said, my voice emerging as little more than a whisper. "In '81, for conducting experiments on wounded men without their knowledge or consent. He administered compounds to soldiers under anesthesia, testing their responses, their susceptibility to suggestion. He believed he could create a kind of medical automaton, a surgeon who could operate without conscious will." "And you testified against him," Holmes said. It was not a question. "I did. He was my tent mate for 3 months at my wand. I trusted him. I admired his skill. He was, God help me, the most technically gifted surgeon I had ever seen. And when I discovered what he was doing to those men who had come to him for healing," I stopped. The memory was a door I had kept locked for 12 years, and opening it now, in the swaying cab with Holmes's steady gaze upon me, required a courage different from, but no less than any I had summoned on the battlefield. "He looked at me during the tribunal," I said, "when the verdict was read, and he smiled. He smiled, Holmes, and he said, 'You will understand eventually, Watson. The hands are wiser than the mind that governs them.'" The chloroform and the compulsion. Holmes received my account of Gale with the stillness of a man absorbing not merely information, but implication, the full, terrible weight of what this history meant for the events of the previous night. When I had finished, he sat forward in the cab, his elbows upon his knees, his fingers pressed together in that cathedral arch that signified his deepest concentration. "Then the pattern is clear," he said, "and it is worse than I had initially supposed. Gale has not merely resumed his experiments, he has perfected them. He has spent the years since his court-martial refining his compound and his technique until he can take a trained surgeon, render him chemically pliable, and direct his hands to perform complex operations while the surgeon's conscious mind remains entirely absent. You were not his victim last night, Watson. You were his instrument." The word fell between us like a stone into deep water. Instrument. My hands, my training, my years of study and practice, all of it requisitioned, borrowed, stolen in the night by a man who viewed human skill as a resource to be harvested rather than a gift to be freely given. "But why?" I asked, though even as the question left my lips, I understood that it carried within it a second, darker question. Not merely why had Gale chosen to use me, but why had my hands, my unconscious, sleeping hands, complied? Holmes answered the spoken question first. "Gale operates a clandestine surgical practice serving those who cannot access legitimate medical care, criminals, fugitives, women in circumstances that the law would rather punish than acknowledge. He requires skilled surgeons but cannot employ them openly. His solution is elegant in its monstrousness. He drugs them, directs them, and returns them to their beds before dawn, leaving them with no memory of their service, and therefore no ability to testify against him." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight I had seldom heard in it. "I owe you an apology, Watson." I stared at him. In all our years of association, I could count upon one hand the number of times Sherlock Holmes had offered an unqualified apology. "Last evening," he said, "I observed that you were restless. I noted a slight dilation of your pupils when you retired, and a faint, sweet odor upon your collar that I attributed to Mrs. Hudson's laundering. I should have recognized it. I should have recognized the early signs of chemical interference. I was absorbed in my own work, and I failed to see what was happening beneath my own roof." He met my eyes, and in his gaze I read something far more devastating than guilt. It was the recognition of fallibility, the admission from the most brilliant mind I had ever known that his great engine of observation had, at the crucial moment, failed to protect the one person it should never have overlooked. "You could not have known," I said. "I should have known," he replied. "That is rather the point of me." Watson's private reckoning. Holmes excused himself at the corner of Threadwell Court to interview a woman who let rooms in the building adjacent to Eleanor Caston's lodgings, leaving me alone in the narrow court with instructions to wait and to touch nothing. It was, I suspect, his way of granting me the privacy he sensed I required, for Holmes understood, with an intuition that contradicted every accusation of coldness ever leveled against him, that there are moments when a man must be left alone with the full weight of what has happened to him, lest the presence of even the most sympathetic witness prevent the necessary reckoning. I stood in that cramped, soot-stained court and looked at my hands. The blood was still there, faded now, worked into the creases and the spaces beneath my nails, reduced by the hours from its initial horror to something quieter, but no less accusatory. I had saved a woman's life with these hands. I had felt, through the medium of drugged sleep, the particular resistance of flesh and the careful, practiced rhythm of suturing. And I had called her Mary, had spoken my dead wife's name over the body of a stranger, as though tenderness were a reflex that survived even the abolition of consciousness. Near the entrance to the court, a standpipe dripped into a stone basin, and I walked toward it with the slow, inevitable steps of a man approaching a confession. I stood before the basin and watched the water gather and fall, and I understood that I could not bring myself to wash. Not yet. Not because Holmes had instructed me to preserve the evidence, though he had, but because the act of washing felt, in that moment, like an erasure I was not entitled to perform. The blood upon my hands was the only proof I possessed that the night had happened at all, the only tangible evidence that connected the man I was to the act I had committed without knowing. To wash it away would be to sever that connection, and I was not yet ready to let go of the only thread that tied me to my own lost hours. I thought of Eleanor Caston's face when she opened her door, the recognition, the gratitude. I thought of her voice saying, "Your hands were so gentle." And I thought of the hands themselves, my hands, a surgeon's hands, trained to heal and forbidden to harm, performing their sacred office in a room they had never chosen to enter, guided by a voice that had no right to command them. The water dripped and gathered, the basin filled and overflowed, and I stood before it with my stained hands at my sides, caught between the desire to be clean and the knowledge that some stains are not meant to be removed until one has fully understood what put them there. When Holmes returned, he found me exactly where he had left me. He glanced at the basin, then at my hands, and said nothing. He understood. He always understood more than he said. Chapter 4. The Reckoning at Gale's Theatre. By noon, Holmes had transformed the sitting room of 221B into a command center, whose apparent disorder belied a structure of extraordinary precision. Maps of the East End covered the dining table, their surfaces annotated in Holmes's angular hand with locations, times, and connecting lines that formed a web whose center, though he had not yet spoken the name aloud, was unmistakably Dr. Mortimer Gale. 3 of the Baker Street irregulars had been dispatched before breakfast. 2 more followed before the Morning Post arrived. Messages went to certain contacts in the shipping offices at Rotherhithe, to a chemist in Clerkenwell who owed Holmes a considerable favour, and to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, requesting his presence at Baker Street by 4 o'clock. I watched these preparations with the peculiar sensation of a man observing the assembly of a weapon that has been designed, at least in part, for his own defence. Holmes moved through his arrangements with the focused, almost musical efficiency that characterized his finest hours. Each action precise, each communication calibrated, each element positioned with the strategic forethought of a chess master who has already seen the end game and is now merely guiding the pieces toward their inevitable positions. "Gale requires another surgeon tonight," Holmes said, pinning a note to the mantelpiece with a jackknife. His network of informants, dock workers primarily, with connections to the criminal underclass, will have already communicated that a woman in Bermondsey has been injured and requires discreet medical attention. I have ensured that this information is both accurate and irresistible. The woman in Bermondsey, I said carefully, does not exist, but the message has been constructed with sufficient verisimilitude to satisfy Gale's inquiries. He will prepare his operating theatre, a new location I expect, since we have compromised Harker Lane, and he will come for a surgeon. Holmes turned to me, and his expression carried the grave clarity of a general outlining a campaign. He will not come for you again. I have taken measures to ensure that. He will recruit another man, and when he does, we shall be waiting. By 3 o'clock, the replies had begun to arrive. The irregulars reported that Gale had been seen entering a warehouse near the Rotherhithe docks. The chemist confirmed that quantities of chloroform and an unusual alkaloid compound had been purchased through intermediaries over the preceding months. And Lestrade, arriving at 4 with his customary blend of skepticism and grudging respect, listened to Holmes's account with an expression that progressed from disbelief through alarm to something approaching professional excitement. "You are certain of this?" Lestrade asked. "I am certain of the evidence," Holmes replied, "which, in my experience, is rather more reliable than certainty of anything else." Watson insists on presence. The argument, when it came, was conducted with the quiet intensity that characterized our most serious disagreements. A private storm contained entirely within the 4 walls of our sitting room, witnessed only by the skull upon the mantelpiece and the patient, indifferent fire. "You will remain here," Holmes said, adjusting his cuffs with the deliberate precision of a man preparing for confrontation. "Lestrade and I shall handle the matter. There is no need for your presence." "No need," I repeated, and the words tasted like ash. "Holmes, this man stole my hands. He entered our home, drugged me under your very roof, and marched me through the streets of London like a puppet. He made me operate on a woman I had never met, in a room I had never entered, and when it was done, he put me back in my bed, like a toy returned to its box. And you tell me there is no need for my presence?" Holmes did not look at me. He busied himself with the selection of items from his desk, a pair of handcuffs, a small revolver, a dark lantern, and his silence was of the variety that I knew to be not indifference but its opposite, a silence generated by the effort of suppressing something he did not wish me to see. "Watson," his voice, when it came, was stripped of its usual analytical armor. "I am not questioning your courage. I have never had occasion to question your courage, and I do not expect to begin tonight. What concerns me is the effect that confronting Gale may have upon what? My fragile sensibilities? My psychological constitution? Upon your ability to restrain yourself from killing him." The words fell into the room like a surgeon's blade, precise, necessary, and cutting straight to the pathology beneath the surface. I opened my mouth to deny the accusation and found that I could not, because Holmes, as was so often and so infuriatingly the case, was right. There existed within me, at that moment, a capacity for violence toward Mortimer Gale that I had not felt since the war. It sat in my chest like a loaded weapon, and we both knew it. "I will master it," I said quietly. Holmes studied me for a long moment. Then he handed me my service revolver. "Yes," he said, with a conviction that felt less like agreement than like faith. "I believe you will." The surgeon's den. The warehouse at Rotherhithe announced itself through the smell before it declared itself through architecture. That same antiseptic sharpness I had detected at Harker Lane, threaded now through the heavier odors of river mud and tarred rope. The building stood at the end of a narrow wharf, its walls rising from the waterline like the hull of a ship that had forgotten its purpose and calcified into brick and timber. A single window on the upper floor showed light, a thin, steady glow that spoke not of habitation, but of work. Lestrade positioned his constables at the 2 exits with the practiced economy of a man accustomed to cordoning premises, and Holmes led our smaller party, himself, Lestrade, and me, through a ground-floor entrance whose lock yielded to Holmes's picks with a whisper of surrendering metal. We climbed a wooden staircase in darkness, guided by the faint light from above and the steady, rhythmic sound of someone moving with purpose on the floor overhead. The room we entered was larger than the one at Harker Lane, but governed by the same terrible logic. A surgical table occupied its center, freshly prepared, its surface covered with clean linen that gleamed in the light of 4 paraffin lamps arranged at precise intervals. The instruments were laid out upon a side table, not merely a surgeon's standard kit, but an extensive collection that spoke of ambition and specialization. Scalpels of varying sizes, bone saws, retractors of a design I did not recognize, clamps whose engineering suggested a mind that had spent years refining the tools of its obsession. Along the far wall, ranked upon shelves with pharmaceutical exactitude, stood dozens of brown glass bottles, chloroform, ether, laudanum, and others whose labels bore chemical formulae I could not immediately identify. Beside them, a leather-bound journal lay open to a page covered in small, precise handwriting. But it was the wall above the shelves that arrested me. Pinned to the brickwork, arranged in neat columns, were photographs and case notes, records of operations performed, patients treated, outcomes documented. Each entry was annotated with a date, a procedure description, and a single set of initials identifying the surgeon who had performed the work. I saw my own initials, JHW, beside 3 entries spanning the past 2 months. 3 times. He had used me 3 times, and I had known nothing. The room swam before my eyes. I felt Holmes's hand close around my forearm, a grip firm enough to steady, gentle enough to comfort, and heard his voice, very low, very near. "Steady, Watson. We are here to end this, and we shall." Gale's philosophy of the scalpel. He did not attempt to flee. When Lestrade's constable sealed the exits and Holmes stepped into the full light of the paraffin lamps, Mortimer Gale turned from his preparations with the unhurried composure of a host welcoming expected guests. He had aged since I had last seen him at the tribunal, the hair thinner, the face more deeply lined, but the eyes were unchanged. Pale, steady, and illuminated from within by the particular light of a man who has long since resolved every moral question to his own satisfaction. "Mr. Holmes," he said, inclining his head with what appeared to be genuine respect. "And Watson, I rather thought you might find your way here eventually." His gaze moved to Lestrade. "Inspector, I trust you have brought sufficient men. I should not wish this to be untidy." "Dr. Mortimer Gale," Lestrade began, with the formal cadence of an arrest, but Gale raised one hand, that immaculate surgeon's hand, and Lestrade, despite himself, paused. "Before you recite the charges," Gale said, "I should like to pose a question, to Watson specifically, though I suspect Mr. Holmes will find it interesting." He turned to me, and his smile was the same smile I remembered from the tribunal, patient, certain, and faintly pitying. "Eleanor Caston, the woman you operated upon 2 nights ago, do you know what would have happened to her had I not brought you to that table?" I said nothing. "She would have died," Gale continued, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a lecturer addressing a particularly slow class. "Bled to death in a Whitechapel alley, one more anonymous casualty of a city that has decided certain lives are not worth the cost of saving. She could not go to a hospital, her circumstances forbade it. The clinics would not touch her. The charitable institutions would have demanded she submit to an interrogation that would have placed her in greater danger than the wound itself." He spread his hands, those clean, terrible hands. "So I found her a surgeon. The finest surgeon I have ever known, as it happens. And that surgeon saved her life." Holmes spoke then, and his voice cut through Gale's rhetoric with the precision of the man's own instruments. "You did not find her a surgeon. You stole one. You entered a private residence, administered a chemical compound without consent, and commandeered a man's body and skills as though they were equipment to be requisitioned. The fact that the outcome was beneficial does not sanctify the method, any more than a successful robbery is sanctified by the thief's donation of the proceeds to charity." Gale's smile did not waver. "A steady hand needs no willing mind, Mr. Holmes. That was true in Afghanistan, and it is true in Rotherhithe. The body knows its work. The hands remember what the intellect would hesitate to undertake. I merely removed the obstacle of conscience, that tedious, self-regarding faculty that would sooner let a woman die than permit its owner to act outside the boundaries of propriety. You removed the obstacle of consent, Holmes replied, which is not conscience. It is the foundation upon which every human interaction of value is built. Without it, your surgery is not medicine. It is assault performed with a healing outcome. And the law, Dr. Gale, does not distinguish between the hand that cuts to save and the hand that cuts to harm, when neither hand was given permission to cut at all. Gale regarded Holmes for a long moment, and something flickered behind those pale eyes. Not doubt, not remorse, but the faintest recognition that he stood before a mind that could not be persuaded, only defeated. "You will understand eventually," he said softly, turning to me. "Both of you." "I understood you 12 years ago," I replied, "and I understand you now." Lestrade stepped forward, and the handcuffs closed around those immaculate wrists with a sound like the final word in an argument that had lasted far too long. The blood on the ledger. With Gale removed to the waiting police wagon below, Holmes conducted his final examination of the operating theatre with the systematic thoroughness I had witnessed 100 times, but which never failed to impress me with its completeness. He catalogued, he measured, he noted. He collected samples of the chemical compound from the bottles on the shelf. He photographed the arrangement of instruments with a small camera he carried for such purposes. And he removed the leather-bound journal from its place above the surgical table and sat beneath one of the paraffin lamps to read it. I watched him turn the pages, his expression shifting through a progression I knew well. Interest, comprehension, confirmation, and finally a cold, settled resolution that meant the case, in his mind, had achieved its definitive shape. The journal, as he would later explain to Lestrade, contained a meticulous record of every operation Gale had orchestrated over the preceding 18 months. 27 procedures in total, performed by 5 different surgeons, none of whom had any conscious knowledge of their participation. Each entry documented the patient, the procedure, the compound administered to the surgeon, and the outcome. Gale had recorded everything with the detached precision of a scientist documenting experimental results, and the cumulative effect of reading his neat, clinical prose was to confront a mind that had elevated the violation of human autonomy to the status of medical philosophy. The cabman's testimony. The chloroform compound, the handwriting sample produced under chemical suggestion. Eleanor Carston's wound, matching precisely the procedure described in Gale's journal for the corresponding date. The journal's own entries, linking my initials to 3 separate operations. The evidence formed a chain whose links were individually strong and collectively unbreakable, and Holmes presented them to Lestrade with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman displaying finished work. When the last constable had departed and the warehouse stood empty save for ourselves, Holmes crossed the room to where I stood and placed Gale's journal in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, not merely in physical weight, but in the moral gravity of what it contained. A record of stolen skill. A ledger of hands that had healed without knowing, without choosing, without consenting to the healing they performed. "This belongs to medicine," Holmes said, "not to madness. See that it reaches the appropriate authorities at the Royal College. They will know what to do with it." I held the journal and felt its weight settle into my palms, the same palms that had performed the surgeries it documented, and understood that I was holding both the evidence of my violation and the record of my unwitting service. It was, in its way, the most complex object I had ever touched. A book of crimes that were also, impossibly, acts of mercy. Holmes watched me for a moment, then turned toward the stairs. "Come, Watson," he said. "It is time to go home." Chapter 5. The Waters of Baker Street. 2 days passed before the world consented to feel ordinary again, and even then its ordinariness carried a quality of performance, as though the familiar objects and rituals of daily life were presenting themselves for my approval, uncertain whether I would still recognize them as my own. I sat in my chair at Baker Street on the morning of the 5th of November and watched Mrs. Hudson arrange the breakfast things with her customary brisk efficiency. She had noticed, I knew, the blood-stained nightshirt I had buried in the laundry basket, and she had observed the unusual hours Holmes and I had kept, and the grave, subdued manner in which we had conducted ourselves since our return from Rotherhithe. But Mrs. Hudson possessed a quality rarer than discretion. She possessed the wisdom to distinguish between secrets that demanded exposure and wounds that required the privacy to heal on their own terms. She poured my tea, set a plate of toast before me, and withdrew without comment, closing the door with the particular gentleness one reserves for the rooms of the convalescing. Holmes had gone out early, a meeting with Lestrade regarding the formal charges, he said, though I suspected he'd also arranged to visit Eleanor Carston to ensure her continued safety and recovery. He had been solicitous in his way over the preceding 2 days, which is to say, he had not once asked me how I felt, but had ensured that the fire was always lit when I entered the sitting room, that my tobacco was replenished before I noticed its absence, and that the newspapers were arranged so that the accounts of Gale's arrest, which had begun to appear on the second day, were placed beneath the sporting pages rather than on top. I drank my tea and listened to London resume its ancient commerce beyond our windows. Carriages passed. A street vendor called out his wares in a voice made musical by repetition. A dog barked somewhere near Regent's Park. The sounds of a city that had continued its business, entire and indifferent, while a man sat in its midst, attempting to reassemble his understanding of himself. I had saved a woman's life. This was a fact, attested to by the woman herself and confirmed by the journal of the man who had made it possible through monstrous means. My hands had done what they were trained to do, had found the wound, had stopped the bleeding, had closed the damage with sutures whose neatness Eleanor Carston's own physician had subsequently praised. And I could not remember any of it. The virtue, if virtue it was, belonged to my body and not to my will, and I could not determine whether this made it more pure or less real. The tea cooled in my hands. The fire breathed softly, and the question that had lodged itself in my chest since the moment Eleanor Carston opened her door continued to pulse with the steady, unanswerable rhythm of a second heartbeat. Holmes and the violin's confession. Holmes returned in the early afternoon, bringing with him the cold scent of the November streets and a quality of stillness that told me the morning's business had been concluded to his satisfaction. He removed his coat, hung it upon its hook with characteristic precision, and crossed the sitting room to the corner where his violin case rested against the bookshelf. He did not speak. He did not need to. I had known Holmes long enough to understand that there were conversations he could only conduct through the medium of his instrument, communications too complex or too delicate for the blunt machinery of language, requiring instead the subtler vocabulary of bow and string. He tuned the violin with the unhurried attention of a man preparing not for performance, but for prayer. Then he stood by the window, where the pale afternoon light fell across his angular features, and he began to play. It was not a piece I recognized. It was not, I believe, a piece at all, not in the formal sense of something composed and committed to paper. It was improvised, born in the moment from whatever architecture of thought and feeling occupied Holmes's mind, and it emerged from the instrument with the hesitant, searching quality of a man feeling his way through a darkened room by touch alone. The melody, if one could call it melody, moved in slow descending phrases that resolved not into conclusion but into question, each passage ending on a note that hung in the air like an outstretched hand waiting to be taken. I sat in my chair and listened, and I understood. This was Holmes's way of saying what he could not say, that he had failed to protect me and would carry that failure as his own private wound, that he had watched me suffer over these 2 days with an anguish he could not express through any channel his formidable mind made available to him, save this one. That the music was not an offering of comfort, but an act of companionship, a refusal to let me sit alone with my pain, even if all he could do was sit beside it and give it a voice. The music continued for perhaps 20 minutes, neither rising to climax nor diminishing to silence, but simply existing. A sustained, living thing that filled the room the way firelight fills a room, not by driving out darkness, but by making it inhabitable. I did not speak. I did not need to. We had passed beyond the territory of speech into a country where 2 men who had shared the better part of a decade could communicate through presence alone, and the violin was merely the bridge between Holmes's silence and my own. When at last he lowered the bow and returned the instrument to its case, neither of us acknowledged what had passed between us. He simply sat down in his own chair, took up his pipe, and gazed into the fire with the expression of a man who has discharged an obligation that no one asked of him and that he will never mention again. The letter from Eleanor Caston. The evening post brought a single letter addressed to me in an unfamiliar hand, a woman's hand, careful and deliberate, forming each letter with the conscious effort of someone for whom writing is an act of will rather than habit. I opened it at my desk while Holmes smoked in silence behind me, and I read it twice before setting it down upon the blotter. Dear Dr. Watson, I am told by Mr. Holmes that you do not remember the night you saved my life. I confess I find this difficult to comprehend, for it is the most vivid night in my own memory, every detail preserved with the terrible clarity that attends those hours in which we discover whether we shall continue to exist. But I write not to burden you with my recollections. I write because Mr. Holmes tells me you are troubled, and I cannot bear the thought that the man who preserved me should suffer for the act of preservation. You may not remember your kindness, Doctor, but my body does. It remembers the steadiness of your hands. It remembers the gentleness with which you worked, even in your strange, distant state. It remembers that you spoke to me, softly, reassuringly, as though some part of you knew, even in sleep, that a woman lay beneath your hands who was frightened and in pain, and needed to hear a human voice. Whatever was done to bring you to that room, what you did within it was holy. I have no other word for it. You healed me, and I am alive, and my daughter, who is 4 years old and knows nothing of that night, still has a mother, because your hands knew their work, even when your mind did not. I remain, with more gratitude than language can contain, Eleanor Caston. I set the letter down and sat for a long time in the quiet of our rooms, watching the firelight move across the familiar surfaces of Baker Street, while something that had been clenched inside my chest for 2 days began, slowly and with great reluctance, to release. It was not absolution. I was not certain absolution was what I required, nor that it was Eleanor Caston's to give. It was something more modest and perhaps more valuable. It was testimony, a witness to an act I could not remember, confirming that even in the darkest theatre of stolen will, something essential in me had refused to be extinguished. I read the letter a 3rd time, and then I folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my journal, where I kept those few documents whose significance transcended their contents, my commission, my discharge papers, and a single photograph of Mary that I could not look at often, but could not bear to store anywhere I might forget its location. Holmes said nothing, but I heard the faintest sound behind me, the creak of his chair as he shifted, and I knew he had been watching and that he understood. Section 5.4. Watson washes his hands. It was nearly midnight when I rose from my chair and crossed the sitting room to the small table where Mrs. Hudson kept a porcelain basin and a jug of water for our use. I had avoided this basin for 2 days, with a consistency that Holmes had certainly observed and charitably refrained from mentioning. The blood upon my hands had faded to a ghost of its original horror, visible now only in the deepest creases of my palms and beneath the edges of my fingernails. But its presence had become a kind of anchor, fixing me to the reality of what had occurred and preventing me from dismissing it as dream or delusion. I poured the water. It was cold. Mrs. Hudson had filled the jug hours ago, and it caught the firelight as it fell into the basin, transforming for a moment into something molten and luminous before settling into stillness. I looked at the water, and I looked at my hands, and I understood that what I was about to do was not merely an act of hygiene, but a decision about who I intended to be on the other side of this night. I placed my hands in the basin. The water received them without judgment. I watched the faint traces of dried blood dissolve and disperse, turning the water first pink, then faintly amber, then clear again, as the evidence of that night's work released its hold upon my skin and surrendered itself to the greater anonymity of water. I washed, carefully, thoroughly, with the attentiveness I had always brought to the preparation of my hands before surgery. That ritual of cleansing that marked the boundary between the ordinary man and the physician, between the hand that shakes and greets and the hand that opens and heals. When I withdrew my hands from the basin, they were clean. Not symbolically, not approximately, but clean. The skin pink and bare, the creases empty, the nails free of any trace of what they had carried. I dried them on the cloth beside the basin and held them before me in the firelight, turning them slowly, examining them as one examines a beloved landscape after a storm has passed, checking for damage, searching for change. They were the same hands. That was the revelation, quiet, undramatic, but profound in its simplicity. They were the same hands that had held a rifle at my wand, that had sutured wounds in the surgical tent, that had written my accounts of Holmes's cases in the study of this very room. They were the same hands that had, without my knowledge or consent, saved Eleanor Caston's life in a clandestine theatre in Limehouse. They were my hands, and whatever had been done with them, they remained mine. Some stains, I understood then, exist not upon the skin, but within the architecture of memory and meaning. They cannot be washed away because they do not reside where water can reach them. They live deeper, in the conscience, in the narrative a man constructs of himself, in the space between what he has done and what he intended. And bearing them is not a punishment. It is simply the cost of having been present, however unwillingly, at a moment when the distance between healing and violation collapsed to the width of a single unconscious breath. The water in the basin settled and grew still. I emptied it into the slop pail and returned the basin to its place. And when I turned back to the sitting room, I found that the fire had burned low and the lamps had dimmed, and the room had arranged itself into that particular configuration of warmth and shadow that I had always associated with the word home. The final reflection at the window. Holmes stood at the window overlooking Baker Street, his silhouette framed against the glass like a figure in a daguerreotype, sharp, still, composed of light and shadow in equal measure. The street below was empty, save for a constable making his rounds, his footsteps marking the quiet rhythm of a city that had surrendered itself to sleep. I joined Holmes at the window, and for a time we stood together in the companionable silence of men who have weathered something difficult and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least intact. "Gale will stand trial," Holmes said at length. "Lestrade assures me the case is more than sufficient. The journal alone would convict him, but combined with the testimony of his victims, both the patients and the surgeons he conscripted, the outcome is beyond question." "And the others?" I asked. "The other surgeons he used?" "They have been contacted, discreetly. Several have experienced episodes of unexplained fatigue and disorientation that they attributed to overwork. None, I believe, suspected the truth. You were the only one who woke with the evidence still upon him." He paused. "I suspect Gale intended for you to wake as you did. I suspect it was his way of announcing himself, of demonstrating to the man who testified against him 12 years ago that his work had progressed beyond anything the tribunal imagined." "A message?" I said. "A boast," Holmes corrected, "dressed in the language of philosophy but motivated at its foundation by the most common of human impulses, the desire to be recognized as exceptional. Gale's crime was not merely the violation of your autonomy, Watson. It was the insistence that his vision of medicine was superior to the profession's own ethical constraints. He believed himself above consent because he believed himself above error." Holmes turned from the window and regarded me with an expression that held none of his customary detachment, an expression, rather, of unguarded and deliberate sincerity. "The truest violation," he said quietly, "is not of the body but of the will. A wound to the flesh may heal. A theft of agency leaves a mark upon the soul that no surgery can address and no passage of time can entirely erase. But I would have you understand something, Watson, and I would have you believe it not because I say it, but because the evidence demands it." He paused, and in that pause the room seemed to contract around us until we stood not in a sitting room in Baker Street, but in some smaller, more essential space. The space that exists between two people who have earned each other's trust through years of shared danger and quiet sacrifice. "Perhaps," he said, his gaze moving toward the lamplit street below. The measure of a man is not what he does when he is master of himself, but what his nature does when his mind has been taken from him. And yours, Watson, even in the dark, chose to heal. I did not answer immediately. I stood beside my friend and watched the lamplight fall upon the empty pavement, and thought of Eleanor Caston and her daughter, of the surgical theatre at Harker Lane, of the blood that had dried upon my hands and the water that had washed it away, and of the strange, irreconcilable truth that the worst night of my life had also been for one woman in Whitechapel, the night she was saved. I have often wondered since, and I put the question now to any soul who may read these words, whether an act of goodness performed without knowledge or consent may still be claimed as one's own. And if not, to whom does the virtue belong? To the hands that performed it? To the mind that directed those hands, however criminal its intent? To the body's own deep memory of its sacred training? Or does it belong to no one, an orphaned mercy, wandering the world without an author, healing without credit, saving without name? I do not know the answer. I am not certain one exists. But I know this. On the 3rd of November, in the year 1894, my hands moved through darkness in service of a life I did not know was in danger, and a woman breathes today because of what they did. And if I cannot remember the act, I can at least honor it by continuing, with whatever consciousness and consent remain to me, to do what I was made to do. To heal, however imperfectly, however uncertainly, to heal. The fire settled in the grate. Holmes returned to his chair, and Baker Street, that most faithful of harbours, held us both in its ancient, imperfect shelter, while the night moved on toward morning, carrying its cargo of questions toward a dawn that promised, if not answers, then at least the light by which to search for them.